Hello everybody, how are you doing? Good to see you again. So what shall we do today? Today we'll conduct a few experiments. We're going to look at a few historical mathematical formulas, and then we'll attempt to build an expressive instrument in Kontakt. And if it all works out, I'll make it available so that everybody can play. This looks more like a trap. By the way, today's video is sponsored by nobody. No sampling company, no Christian Hansen. Today's video is actually sponsored by Johann Carl Friedrich Gauss. James and John wanted to chip in, but Gauss, in his 19th century German accent, he said, "Jungs, I've got it." All right. But first, let me give you a little bit of context into why we try today's experiment. You see, I play a little bit of keyboards, a little bit of guitar, a little bit of other instruments, but I am self-taught. Please, can you keep the microphone close, but not in the shot? Right? Thanks. Yeah, there is good. So I am self-taught and I cannot read music. That's why when I play, I make a lot of theoretical mistakes, but that's okay, I don't care. Do I look like someone that takes himself seriously? Oh yeah, it makes you laugh? You find it funny? Do I entertain you? Funny how? Anyway, I was lucky enough to be raised in a house full of pianos, and that gave me the chance to try different key beds. And as a byproduct, I developed a good sense of dynamic velocity range. So when in the early 2000s I found myself without a real piano, I resorted to VSTs, and one of the first VSTs I tried was the Grant by Steinberg. 900 megabytes, but it didn't do it for me. So in 2006 I got my hands on a newly developed software called Kontakt, which had a plasticky sound. However, the performing experience was so good that one could forget the sound. Why did I sacrifice the sonic quality of an actual recorded piano to a plasticky sound that offers superior performance experience? Kontakt employs physical modeling. It uses mathematics to approximate what happens physically, and that achieves a very smooth gradation through velocity layers. Who is looking for me this time? There's another one. Anyway, when you use a sample-based instrument, when you move along velocities, you play different samples. Kontakt, because it offers a continuum of dynamics, appears to the performer, especially for someone that is used to playing on real pianos, to be more rewarding. So the question is, can we recreate the performance experience using samples, doing it in Kontakt? And this will be the subject of today's video. So let's head back to the Stukas laboratories to show you today's experimental subject. So today's experimental subject will be this guitar. A little disclaimer. I don't want to sample the perfect guitar. We're just using this guitar as a source for a sound to create an organic Kontakt instrument. Alright? So let me explain to you the problem with velocity layers. Right, here in Kontakt, I loaded the nylon guitar from the Kontakt's factory library. Here we have our familiar mapping editor, and you see that the samples are layered along the velocity axis. If I play softly, I'm playing only this sample, and only after I cross a certain velocity point, I'll play the next sample. And then if I cross a further velocity, I go into the third and finally fourth sample. So the fact that there are different samples for different velocity ranges might be okay for the applications of creating a mock-up. If you want to perform and you want to get an organic performance, it would make more sense if the velocity was more a continuum. Let's get the whole thing here. Right? So, how can we rectify this? Naively, one would think, okay, why don't I have a softly played sample and a hard sample, and then create a long crossfade between the two. That would give me a sort of continuum. For our experiment, we are going to sample one of the strings of this guitar, just one, at the soft level and at the hard level. Come on, girls, which one of you wants to be sampled? No E, you have to lose a little bit of weight. No E, you're too skinny. D. So I'll record a soft playing D and a hard perform D. And we will try to create a long crossfade between these two notes and see what happens. So here we have our soft sample and our hard sample. And the idea is to crossfade between our soft and our hard sample depending where on the velocity axis we are. Now let's think a little bit about the anatomy of a crossfade. But Chromo, we are not stupid, we know what a crossfade is. Yes, maybe you are not stupid, but sometimes I am slow, so I have to think in simple terms. Picture on this axis that you have increasing velocity, and this is increasing volume, right? Imagine your soft sample is represented by a blue line and the hard sample by a red line. Now at low velocities, the volume of the soft sample will be at a maximum, and the level of your hard sample will be at a minimum. But as you increase the velocity, then the volume of the soft sample decreases and the volume of the hard sample increases until they reach the middle of the velocity range, where you play 50% of the soft sample and 50% of the hard sample. They then cross over until you reach the maximum velocity, where the hard sample represents 100% of the volume and the soft sample represents 0. Let's investigate the 50% region, where 50% of the volume comes from the hard sample and 50% comes from the soft sample. So let's look at the waveform. Chromo, what is a waveform? Well, the waveform is a complex signal. After you combine all the sine waves of the different harmonics characterized by these peaks and these valleys. Watch my previous videos like breaking into Spitfire audio and making a sampling instrument out of thin air. This is our hard sample and this is our soft sample. So if we try to align it, let's say from the beginning, we can use this peak as an alignment point. Alright? So what will happen if we play 50% of one sample and 50% of the other sample is that we are going to get an average between this and this peak, and an average between this valley here and this valley. This will result in some sort of morphing between the two, an intermediary level that will sound very nice to the ear. But if we move further into the sample, we'll see that at some point, like for example here, whereas in the hard sample you have a hill, in the soft sample you have a valley. The two waves will cancel each other out, which results in phasing. Let's say, okay, I want to synchronize them here. Now, if we move somewhere else in the sample, you'll see that they got asynchronized again. In other words, we are not able to synchronize, phase align our samples properly along the whole length. And the problem with this phasing issue, where as we crossfade, one sample is not fully aligned with the other sample, will cause little cancellations. The problem is that your ear, actually your brain, is extremely good at division, especially division of sine wave frequencies. So if there is uneven morphing through velocity layers, your ear will sense there is something unnatural. So what is the solution? Perhaps we could phase align our samples. And some companies do that. But we are going to approach it in a different way, like more lazy way, maybe more artificial way. But at the end of the day, if the result is good, then we don't care how we achieve the result. In order to do that, history lesson. Let me introduce you to the sponsor of this video. After a coffee. For the jealous, this is April in Germany. It was a long coffee and a strange coffee. April is a strange month. Today's sponsor, let's call him Carl Gauss. You know Gaussian blur, Gaussian distribution. It's the same guy. Carl was born in Lower Saxony, Braunschweig, and he was a mathematical prodigy. Just to imagine, at barely 3 years of age, he corrected his father's mathematical mistake. The way the story was told to me was that his father was doing some financial calculations, and little Carl said, "Father, your mistake on page 4 cracks me up." And his dad said, "Yeah." The relationship was never the same again. The mother came, gave the dad a pretzel, and he went away. Anyhow, Carl grew to be a very famous mathematician, and one day, while he was sitting in his office, contemplating the frequencies of planetary motion, let me show you where he was sitting. Here we are in this glorious place. While Gauss was over there, contemplating the mathematics of planetary motion.
But it's on Platz.
What?
It's on Platz.
It's on Platz. What do you mean? Why? Was Ohm less important? You know, Ohm's law. So I drove all these kilometers to the wrong place. Well, by the way, these are the headquarters of Siemens. Fancy walking in and asking them for a 2 million euro grant for the development of virtual instruments. So while Gauss was thinking how to break down the complex motions of planetary objects, he devised a Fourier series, transform matrix multiplication, to break down the complex signal into its individual components, something along the lines of signal decomposition. In a way, he invented Fourier series before Mr. Fourier himself, the so-called discrete Fourier transform. But Gauss went a step further. He used a conquer and divide approach to make the calculations even faster. At the time of Gauss, computers were not there, and therefore he did not really appreciate the paradigm shift. And true to his motto, which was few but ripe, he would have been a horrible YouTuber. He locked his seminal discovery, thinking that it's not worth the limelight of scientific attention. Now, over the next 160 years, a lot of other people revisited and reinvented part of that original Gauss calculation, until in 1965, our mates John and James came up with what we now call the fast Fourier transform, which takes the discrete Fourier transform, which is a calculation described by n square, to a calculation that is much faster, described by n log n. As you can imagine, the higher the n, the more computationally expensive the calculation is. And n log n makes that calculation computationally efficient. Turn out to be one of the most important concepts in digital signal processing by breaking down complex signals into its individual components. If you can break down something, you can also build something. The fact that we are able to stream movies over the internet, data compression, images, sound, in telecommunications, in many other applications, FFT is amazing. Now, how is FFT relevant to us and to our today's problem? Well, FFT allows you to do things like this. A bird has interfered with my recording. I could do something like this with FFT. And then there is no bird. But no, I'm joking. Let's undo that. More birds in. And now becomes a symphony of birds. It also allows spline editors, spline EQs. We'll explore that side of FFT to see whether we can phase correct our sample so that when we crossfade, it sounds morph-like rather than jumping through different layers. So let's exploit FFT in the form of spline EQs. Here in Cubase, I set a loop around my soft sample. Now I'm going to load Curve EQ, which is the stock EQ that comes together with Cubase. But most DAWs have an equivalent spline EQ, and you could also use Audacity or other free software. The first thing I'm going to do here is to open this static and match window here. I'm going to start playing my sample, and I will see here in the EQ the fundamental and all the harmonics of the sound. Once this stabilized, I'm going to take. This is the frequency spectrum of my soft sample. And now let's do the same thing with the hard sample. One is the soft sample and the red is the hard sample. The hard sample has more upper harmonics and some are exaggerated. This gives us an opportunity now to EQ the hard sample to sound as the soft sample. Why shouldn't we approach it the opposite way? The hard sample contains more harmonics. It's much easier to sculpt harmonics that are there than to boost harmonics that are not there. I'm going to set my soft sample as a reference and the hard sample to apply to. I am going to press match spectrums. This curve takes this sample, here shown in red, and it EQs it to the soft sample. Now I can select my hard sample, the whole of it, and render it in place with this EQ curve. Let's do it, render in place. Great, now I can switch off my curve EQ. And now let's check how they all sound. This is the real hard sample. This is the real soft sample. Back to the real hard sample. And to the fake soft. So what we achieved is to get a soft sample from the hard sample using a very precise EQ. But chromophonic, why? What's the advantage of this? Let's look at the waveform. We'll see that now, if we synchronize or phase align our hard sample with our fake soft sample, and if we even try to phase align it with the real soft sample, we'll see that the hard sample and the fake soft FFT sample are relatively well aligned, and the real soft sample starts going asynchronous on us. If we go further into the sample, the real hard and the fake soft are still relatively well aligned, but the real soft one went out of phase. Even if we go really deep into the sample, we'll see that mostly the hard and the FFT soft sample are well aligned in their phases, which is not the case for the real soft sample. What are the ramifications of this? When you crossfade between the real hard and the fake soft FFT sample, you will get an average that still sounds like an intermediary sound of the actual physical string vibrating. So there won't be any artificial cancellations because of phase alignment issues. So what we need to do now is simply decide where to chop our sample or beginning. I prefer to chop a little bit into the sample at a zero crossing preferentially. And now I will export this loop region of the real hard sample and the same region of the synchronized FFT generated soft sample, and we'll import them in Kontakt and we'll see what we can do there. If you made it to this part of the video, respect, I almost didn't. But now we are going to build the instrument in Kontakt and we'll check out some very interesting tricks. Double click, range icon. I will move relatively fast through the instrument building process. But if you feel that you are lost or I am too fast, check my Kontakt reference video that gives a contextual overview of the different parts of Kontakt. Now then, we are going to visit our mapping editor, where we'll drop our soft FFT sample and we'll extend the range. And I also wanted to stop playing at the high velocity ranges. I'll do the same with the hard sample, extend the range, but this time I wanted to start playing from 1/4 up the velocity range. So you see now that the overlap between the hard and the soft sample is within the middle range. Now I can select both of my layers, right click, go to batch tools and select auto apply by velocity. So this will create a crossfade, and you can visualize the crossfade by clicking on the sample. You see the soft sample is reduced as the velocity increases, and the opposite holds true for the hard sample, and somewhere in the middle they play 50%. So you have a smooth linear crossfade between the two. Now we are going to hook up velocity to a bunch of parameters. My favorite thing to modulate is sample start. Sometimes I modulate sample start for no apparent reason. I'm just in love with sample start. If I go to my modulation in the source module and I assign velocity to regulate here sample start, and I activate what I showed you in my previous video, as velocity increases, the sample start increases. So if I play hard, the start position cuts into the sample. Now I want the opposite. I want the harder I play, the earlier the start position. So the harder I play, it starts from the beginning, and the softer I play, it cuts into the sample, you see? And if I increase my velocity, now this is extreme and you have to finesse this a little bit, so I'm going to change the curve dynamics so that at low velocities it starts a little bit into the sample, and as I increase my velocity it starts from the beginning and it gives a more abrupt start. I'm also going to hook my velocity to volume, and you see as the velocity increases the volume increases, and I want this to have more effect, so I increase this slider to about 63%. And finally I want to hook up my velocity to the attack of the sample and add velocity to modulate attack. As it stands, higher the velocity, higher the attack. I want the opposite. I want higher the velocity, lower the attack. And you can see here this orange light at the attack if I play soft. And if I play harder, the attack is shorter. So what have we achieved? Velocity controls where the crossfade takes place between our hard and our soft sample. Velocity controls when the sample starts. Velocity controls the volume of the sample, and velocity controls the attack dynamics. Since velocity is a continuous controller of 127 distinct levels, you are almost guaranteed that every time you play a key, you will get a different sound, and this will enhance the illusion of expressiveness. So for skin creation and the creative process, it's very simple and straightforward. I take a magnifying lens and I examine details of the instrument. For example, I find this pattern here very interesting, and I find these pegs here very interesting, and the strings. What I usually do, I take my phone and I take macro pictures of these textural elements, import them in a graphics program, and then build a simple skin in Kontakt. So now let's check what I managed to come up with. I came up with this. The Fast and Fourier model. There are 4 buttons here that you can activate 4 different groups sampled from one of the strings of this guitar. We have sliders controlling the delay, reverb, and this is a velocity calibration slider. Different keyboards have different sensitivities. For example, this is somewhere in the middle. This is a very slow electric piano that I like, and this is an extremely fast keyboard. I always like to have a velocity calibration slider that allows me to find the sweet spot of expression. Apart from that, we have our Stugas audio logo, and I decided, since we used this fast Fourier transform, to trademark the FNF-LE method, which stands for Fast and Fourier Layer Enhancement. Let's give it a try. I will go for, no, actually, let's go for model number 2. And now I'll put this instrument to the so-called round robin stress test. You have to download it and check how much expression it allows you. I'm not going to go through all the presets. I'm going to make a separate video doing a walkthrough, but you can download it to play with it on the Stuga's audio webpage. Links in the description. All right? I hope you learned something useful in this video, and until next time, stay happy.